Welcome to part two of the lecture on the school to prison pipeline. Okay, so just to sort of refresh and review, the school to prison pipeline refers to educational and criminal justice practices that started in the 1980s that directly and indirectly push children out of school and onto a pathway to prison. Just want to make sure that we're reviewing that so that we're clear about what we're talking about. Some of the factors that contribute to the school to prison pipeline include um, the use of zero tolerance disciplinary policies, over policing and surveillance in schools, referring students to law enforcement and the juvenile justice system, and also some of the instructional and classroom management practices that are used that dehumanize students. Now, one of the things that I want to make sure that we do and that we make a connection on is we want to make sure that we're connecting the school to prison pipeline to some of the other societal factors that are taking place that have given rise to it. And two of those factors are the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. And the two are really connected. The prison industrial complex is basically the way in which private industry has influenced the prison industry. So we've got private companies that do business where they're able to make money off of the building of prisons and the maintenance of prisons and feeding inmates and things like that. So these companies have engaged and involved themselves with government policies and practices and with politicians in ways that have influenced the creation of policies that lead to the building of more prisons. So this is a factor. The prison industrial complex has influenced the building and the maintenance of prisons. And this creation of the prison industrial complex has led to a phenomenon called mass incarceration. And this is basically the way in which the United States jails and imprisons a significantly large percentage of people. And if you look at the statistics there um, on the slide, you'll see. And the most striking statistic is that the United States makes up about 5% of the world's population, but we imprison 25% of the world's prison population. So, in other words, if you look at all of the prisoners in all of the different countries across the face of the earth, 25% of them are people who are imprisoned in the United States. And that's more than countries that are much larger than the United States. China has well over 1 billion people, and they don't imprison nearly as many people as we do in the United States. So the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration are social factors and political factors and economic factors that we have to look at to help us understand um, where the school to prison pipeline comes from and how it connects with other social issues that we're dealing with. And when we look at the school to prison pipeline, we have to examine some of the disparities. Take a look at who will end up in prison. 1 out of 3 black boys, 1 of 6 Latino boys, 1 of 17 white boys. So again, we have to take a look at the racial disparities that are involved with the school to prison pipeline. Another important factor is that the school to prison pipeline has an impact on schools and on the communities that our children come from. Just taken in total, 1 in 14 kids in America have an incarcerated parent. And when you drill down and you take a look at the racial numbers, you'll see that 1 in 9 black children have an incarcerated parent. And we'll also see that black and Native American women are overrepresented in the prison population. And 80% of women in prison have school-age children. So these are factors that affect our kids. We talk about improving relations between schools, families, and communities. You know, that's something that gets affected by the fact that we have such large numbers of parents of the children that are in our schools who are incarcerated. So these are things that we have to be cognizant of. And these are issues that are related to the school to prison pipeline and are manifestations of the school to prison pipeline. Okay. So again, taking these two factors into account, we have to think of the federal government policies that play a role in the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. We also have to take a look at the involvement of private companies and businesses. They wield political influence. They have their lobbyists and their lobbying organizations that lead and um, challenge politicians to set policies that will be in favor of the creation and development of more prisons. And these policies and practices put kids at greater risk of criminal justice involvement. So we have to understand and be aware of these factors. And again, as I said in the previous week, these things don't happen in a vacuum. What happens nationally influences the policies that are instituted in our schools that affect the children that we teach. Okay. Um, Now, last week I took a look at the school to prison pipeline more from a racial perspective. But what I want to do this week is take a look at some other um, populations or groups of marginalized students who are negatively impacted by the school to prison pipeline. One group are students with disabilities. And some of the statistics that we see here on this slide are glaring. Kids with disabilities are more than twice as likely to receive an out of school suspension than their non disabled peers. Students with disabilities make up 12% of the total student population, but constitute over 25% of all students involved in school related arrests. So that's twice the number, double the number of students with disabilities who are in the school population are involved in school related arrests. They experience disproportionate levels of being placed in seclusion and also of being restrained as well. Okay. Um, in terms of students with disabilities, over 5% of the kids in elementary school with disabilities are suspended. That's more than double the overall suspension rate of all students. Um, in secondary school, almost 20%. Um, and kids with emotional disabilities are suspended at glaringly high rates as well. And emotional disabilities is an interesting category because in many ways that's a subjective category. It's not like something like, Down syndrome or autism that has a very, very specific diagnosis. School psychologists and teachers and administrators have leeway in terms of who gets deemed as having an emotional disability. Okay, so that's a problem. That's what we consider a subjective disability. And again, children of color are disproportionately diagnosed with emotional disabilities. In terms of the juvenile justice system, over 75% of students in juvenile justice facilities have disabilities and need some form of special education services. So we see these problems and these disparities cropping up in schools. And of course, they reverberate because when students have disciplinary problems and they're referred to the criminal justice system, what happens? They often end up in juvenile justice facilities. Um, this next fact is very glaring. The percentage of youth with disabilities in juvenile justice is 4 to 7 times the national average. So it's almost like kids with disabilities are, we really haven't developed effective ways for teaching them and supporting them in schools. So, they're being tracked into the juvenile justice system. And of course, as they age and with high rates of recidivism, individuals with disabilities often end up being in adult prisons as well. Uh, and then there's another statistic that we have to look at. We've got this large percentage of students with disabilities, but only 25% of them, one fourth, are actually receiving the special education services that they need. So again, these statistics in terms of students with disabilities are jarring, and they definitely warrant our attention. So we talked about students with disabilities. We also have to talk about um, students from the LGBTQ community. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, and queer youth are disproportionately forced into the school to prison pipeline as well. Now, LGBTQ students have risk factors that contribute to this. Family rejection is a real problem. We have a lot of kids, um, LGBTQ youth, who end up homeless and dispossessed because they've been rejected by their families. And with that rejection comes instability and poverty, and also zero tolerance policies in schools are often targeted at them. So they receive a large brunt of the kinds of treatment that leads or tracks students into the school to prison pipeline. Some of the disparities experienced by LGBTQ youth include that they're over 3 times more likely to experience harsh disciplinary treatment um, than their straight counterparts. They're at greater risk of being suspended or expelled than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. And also schools with that have school resource officers or SROs are more likely to refer LGBTQ students into the juvenile justice system. And again, this is where that bias comes in. As a society, we have a long way to go in terms of really supporting and humanizing um, LGBTQ youth. And a lot of times, school resource officers and teachers and administrators have biases when it comes to dealing um, with LGBTQ students. And these patterns show up in the way in which these kids are disciplined. Other disparities experienced by LGBTQ youth. Um, they're often overburdened by zero tolerance policies. We know that students in this particular demographic, they get discriminated against, they're bullied, and they face harassment in schools. So they're often, punished um, based on their own victimization. So a lot of times you'll have kids who are LGBTQ who attempt to defend themselves or protect themselves, and they end up being disciplined in situations where they're just trying to, stand up and protect themselves. They also face a lot of unfair sanctions just in terms of being who they are. They're often hit with dress code violations, and they're often cited and sanctioned for their behavior. We all know that adolescents, when they reach adolescence and they develop attractions um, to other students, they will kiss, they will hold hands, and they will do other things. So a lot of times LGBTQ students are sanctioned more harshly um, than kids who are so-called straight or than their non-LGBTQ peers. So again, these are all factors that we really have to take into account when we think about students in this population. Okay, LGBTQ youth in the juvenile justice system. They are 5 to 7% of the overall population, yet they make up 20% of all youth in juvenile justice facilities. Almost 40% of the girls in juvenile justice facilities are LGBTQ young ladies. So again, we see the discrimination take place in schools. And because schools are so actively involved in referring kids to juvenile justice, we see these same patterns repeat themselves within the juvenile justice system. Now, we're looking at students with disabilities and also students in the LGBTQ community, um, but there are some significant correlations with race as well. In terms of Black students with disabilities, Black kids with disabilities are almost 4 times as likely to experience multiple suspensions than their white counterparts. And they're almost 2 times as likely to be expelled from school as their white counterparts. Native American kids with disabilities are 3.5 times more likely to have multiple suspensions. Additionally, they're about 3 times as likely to be expelled from school as their white counterparts. And when we merge race with gender, we'll see that the percentage of LGBTQ students suspended or expelled by race reveals some real disparities too. 47% of Black and African American kids, and 44% of Latino or Latinx or Hispanic kids, 36% of white or your American kids are suspended or expelled from school. And again, these are kids from these racial backgrounds who are also LGBTQ. Um, 85% of LGBTQ youth in juvenile justice facilities are kids of color. So again, we have to consider intersectionality. I know a lot of times we talk about, well, why do we always have to deal with race? But because in America, it shows up in just about everything. And it would be irresponsible of us to not take a look at how race intersects with these other demographic areas in terms of the school to prison pipeline. Okay, so last week, again, we took a look at race. This week, we took a look at students with disabilities and kids in the LGBTQ community, just to make sure that we're fleshing this thing out and that we have a broad view of it and we understand who it affects. But we also want to spend some time talking about what we can do to actually disrupt the school to prison pipeline. Yes, the school to prison pipeline is a structural problem that's bigger, than what individual teachers can do. Um, but there are specific things that teachers can do in their classrooms to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. And this is the point that I want to make for the rest of this presentation. Okay. So the first thing that teachers can do is just resist this urge to criminalize student behavior. And really what we're talking about is what you want to do as a teacher is keep it to as much as is possible. Keep students in your classroom and keep police and authority figures like your principal and other administrators out of your classroom. Find ways to deal with and address behaviors in your classroom space so that you don't have to send kids out. Sending kids out and sending them to the school police officer and getting them suspended. These are all factors, again, that contribute to the school to prison pipeline. So one of the things you can do is just teach and model the behaviors that you want your kids to demonstrate. Okay, teach and role play the rules, routines, and procedures that you establish. Also, and I think this was a powerful aspect of our last Monday night meeting, was understanding which student behaviors are triggers for you. Consider your experiences as a teacher, write down these behaviors, and do your own research and start developing strategies that you can use to address these behaviors that trigger you and that may or that would under normal circumstances lead you to send a student out of the classroom. During our meeting on the 23rd, we were able to look at 6 categories of behavior that may be triggers: inattention, needless talk, moving around the room, defiance of authority, disruption, aggression, and fighting. But what we were also able to do is just come up with strategies and practices that will enable you to address those behaviors in your classroom so you don't have to send kids out. So again, you've got that PowerPoint. I encourage you to go back and look at that and use that in your instructional planning. Okay. Another thing we want you to do is employ culturally responsive classroom management practices. And of course, we did a module on that. And some things you can do in this direction are to make sure you establish a clear classroom structure. Establish 3 to 6 rules that govern general classroom behavior. Set clear routines and procedures, for bathroom breaks and collecting materials, making transitions, special circumstances. Make sure you develop a seating arrangement that meets individual students' needs and provides opportunities for kids to collaborate. And that allows for you to be flexible in terms of seating so that you can, make changes and make adjustments as you move through. Okay, another thing that you can do to disrupt the school to prison pipeline in your classroom is to create a culturally responsive learning environment. So what you want to do is you want to develop an engaging and relevant physical environment for your students, because you want to create an environment for your students so that they'll actually want to be in class and won't engage in behaviors that will get them sent out of class. One of the things you can do is you can acknowledge the countries of origin that kids come from. Have posters and images with positive representations of the cultures that your students come from. Um, Make sure that your students are featured in your classroom. Include pictures of your students where they're involved in activities that they enjoy. And make sure your classroom library has works by diverse authors and texts and texts with that support your students' diverse interests. So look at the classroom environment that you're setting up. Another thing that you need to do is teach with relevancy, purpose, and urgency. Make sure your lessons are well planned, relevant, and highly engaging. Okay, so this semester, we've done a significant amount of work with using critical pedagogy practices in your instruction. So what you want to do is get to the point where this is just a part of your daily practice. Okay, you're engaging in asset-based instruction. You're actively incorporating students' funds of knowledge. You're doing the things you need to do to figure out what your students' funds of knowledge are. Making sure that students' cultural and linguistic identities are part of daily learning. Making sure that in your teaching, you're including the perspectives of students from marginalized groups. And also, you want to differentiate your instruction so that all of your kids can experience success. Okay. You also want to teach and allow students to demonstrate their knowledge using multiple pathways, using movement, engaging in arts-based learning opportunities, incorporating music into instruction, allowing students to engage with technology. Okay, these are all ways, that you can make learning relevant and interesting and exciting and provide students with opportunities to be successful. Also, you want to provide students with opportunities to make choices in terms of how they demonstrate their learning. Um, Another thing that you can do is build culturally responsive relationships with your students. You want to communicate and relate with students in culturally responsive ways. Greet students at the door before they enter the classroom. Um, in situations where you're doing online learning or hybrid teaching and learning, set up some sort of a greeting ritual for these situations. Adopt what we call a warm demander teacher stance. Have high expectations for your students. Be firm in communicating how and when you want things done, but you want to do that in a caring and respectful way. Students really respect teachers who demonstrate that they have high expectations for them, but who are also able to do that in a warm and in a loving way. So you've got to, strike that balance, have high expectations, be a warm demander. Let students know you care about them, but you have to let your students know that you mean business. Okay. And also, you want to praise students often and praise them publicly. You know, have rituals for celebration in class, and ensure that all of your students at some point have opportunities to be celebrated and to experience being celebrated for something that they've accomplished or an area that they've grown in. And another very important factor is to make sure that you're incorporating restorative practices in your classroom. Okay. Again, you want to actively teach expected behaviors. One of the mistakes we make often is we teach information and content, um, but we punish for misbehavior. We have to flip the script on that. We have to start teaching the kinds of behaviors that we want our students to engage in. Affirm positive behavior. Okay, students are doing what they're supposed to do. You actively you affirm that. You know, Gene, I like the way that you're focused in class today. Andre, I really appreciate the way that you raised your hand in class today. Uh, those are things that you can do. Openly acknowledge behavioral growth and improvement. When you see students growing and improving, acknowledge that. Let them know that you see that and you see them. Redirect unwanted behaviors. Also help students understand how their actions affect others. That's a very important aspect of teaching students. Um, the kinds of behavioral skills that you want them to know in your classroom. They have to understand that their behaviors have consequences for others. And also you want to provide students with opportunities to correct those behaviors and make amends in situations where they may have done harm to somebody. And you want to do these things in ways that where you're handling them in your classroom and you don't have to toss kids out. So that's the main thing. Um, that I want you to get out of this idea of disrupting the school to prison pipeline within your classroom. Do anything and everything that you can to address behavior within your classroom space and without getting outside people involved, like school police officers or your administrator, um, or anybody else, for that matter. But take as much responsibility for it as you can, and also, do your research. You've got all of these great tools at your disposal. Everything that we've done in this class, pretty much up until this time, um, is something that you can use and that you can do to help disrupt the school to prison pipeline. So make use of these things in your lesson planning and in your teaching. You know, go through these lectures, go through what we've talked about on the Monday night sessions, and actively use these things. Begin to incorporate them into your planning and into your instruction. Schools, not jails. You know, um, I think that pretty much sums it up in a nutshell. So again, use the strategies and the techniques that I'm sharing with you, and that um, we are sharing with you in the course.